President Trump has suggested talks aimed at ending the war in Iran could resume this week after negotiations collapsed at the weekend, prompting the US to blockade Iranian ports. His remarks came as the American military said no ships had passed through the US-enforced blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas in the first 24 hours of operation. The Iranian side has not yet responded to Mr. Trump's remarks. Last weekend's talks in Islamabad lasted for around 21 hours and were led by the US Vice President J.D. Vance, but they ended without any agreement. Mr. Vance said there was still a lot of mistrust between the two countries, but he believed the Iranians still wanted to make a deal. Here's our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes.
When he emerged from Saturday's marathon session of talks in Islamabad, J.D. Vance said he had bad news. Despite having substantive discussions with Iranian officials, they did not reach an agreement to end the war. But since returning to the US, the Vice President has insisted some progress was made.
Honestly, after 49 years, there's a lot of course, mistrust between Iran and the United States of America. You're not going to solve that problem overnight. But yeah, I think the people we're sitting across from wanted to make a deal. And I know the President of the United States told us to go out there and negotiate in good faith.
Now President Trump is hinting that the talks could resume. He told the New York Post that a fresh round of negotiations with Tehran could take place in Pakistan over the next 2 days. There are still huge hurdles to overcome, starting with free movement of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and the main issue, the US demand that Iran abandons its nuclear program.
The president set a policy. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and right now we are negotiating to make sure that very thing happens. And here's, what's interesting about this is What's interesting about this is that we have this ceasefire that's in place. I think it's 6 or 7 days old. Right now, this ceasefire is holding.
Iran has said diplomacy with the US is continuing, but there's been no response to Donald Trump's suggestion that new talks are imminent. Peter Bowes, BBC News.
Israel and Lebanon have held their first face-to-face talks in more than 30 years. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio led the US-brokered talks in Washington, along with the Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors to the US. Negotiations lasted more than 2 hours. Lebanon called the talks productive and reiterated the need for a ceasefire and ways to address the current humanitarian crisis there. Israel was also optimistic about negotiations, repeating its goal of disarming Hezbollah. A US statement said the two sides agreed to meet again, but didn't name a location. It follows 6 weeks of Israeli bombardment in Lebanon, in which more than 2,000 people have been killed. Iran-backed Hezbollah, which has been firing rockets at Israel, has described the talks as futile, saying that they won't surrender. Here's Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
This is a country exhausted by wars. So I think the priority here for the Lebanese and also for the Lebanese government is a ceasefire to end this conflict that has been devastating for Lebanon. More than 2,000 people have been killed. More than 1 million people have been displaced. This means 1 in 5 of the population here has had to leave their home. So it has been a very difficult moment for this country. But I think, one of the roots of this conflict is Hezbollah's weapons, and this is something that the Lebanese government cannot deliver. So let's not forget that the war here is not between the state of Lebanon and Israel. This is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, which is this powerful militia political party supported by Iran. And many in Lebanon want Hezbollah to be disarmed. They say that they're tired of these wars. The Hezbollah has been dragging Lebanon into these wars with Israel, and that Hezbollah is more interested in defending the interests of Iran. On the other hand, you have roughly a third of the population who is Shia. Many of them are supporters of Hezbollah, and they say, look, we need the weapons because the country is being invaded. We have what they say is the enemy, Israel, trying to seize Lebanese land, and they say that the state is unable to protect them. So it is a little bit of a catch-22 situation. And the president here has been saying for a very long time, and everybody who understands the situation in Lebanon knows that, it is impossible for Hezbollah to be disarmed by force. You're not going to have the Lebanese military going to those areas, those communities, to seize weapons. You would end up having a situation in which Lebanese are fighting Lebanese. In other words, a lot of violence, unrest, the possibility of a civil war here in this country. So what the Lebanese authorities have been saying is that there needs to be a deal with Hezbollah. This is not going to happen overnight. And what Hezbollah is saying is that they don't recognize those talks that are happening, and they say they're not going to accept any kind of negotiations about the group's weapons, or they're not going to abide by any decision being made in those talks.
Hugo Bachega in Beirut. Our correspondent Yolande Nell is in Jerusalem, and she gave us the reaction from Israel.
Well, a lot of focus on what the Israeli ambassador to the US was saying. He was certainly the more positive of the two ambassadors from this region at the talks. And he said that Israel and Lebanon shared the same aim to end what he called the occupation of Lebanon by Hezbollah. We understand these talks went on for a couple of hours. Another thing that the Israeli ambassador said, we talked about a number of things, most importantly, the long-term vision. Where there will be a clearly delineated border between the two countries, and when the only reason we'll need to cross into each other's territory will be in a business suit to conduct business or in a bathing suit to go on vacation. So offering quite a sort of rosy future image there. And that is what Israel has been seeking in these talks, is, you know, the ultimate goal of a peace deal with Israel and Lebanon, and also really saying that, you know, there's no chance at the moment for a ceasefire until Hezbollah itself is disarmed. And, you know, all of this taking place as communities in the north of Israel have continued to come under fire from Hezbollah. It seemed that actually stepped up as the talks were taking place in Washington, as Hezbollah sought to show its anger and its opposition to the direct talks happening, the first direct talks in more than 30 years between representatives of Israel and Lebanon. Recent days, both the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Defense Minister have been talking about the need to keep Israeli forces on the ground in southern Lebanon to maintain this occupation. They're talking about creating what they call a security buffer zone to protect the tens of thousands of Israeli civilians who've been coming under fire in the north of Israel.
Yolande Nell in Jerusalem. The Chancellor Rachel Reeves says she's very frustrated and angry that the US went to war with Iran without a clear exit plan, as she prepares to hold a series of meetings in Washington to discuss the growing economic crisis. It comes after the International Monetary Fund warned that the economic fallout from the conflict would hit the UK harder than any other advanced economy. Our chief political correspondent Henry Zeffman spoke to us earlier with political reaction to the IMF's announcement.
Though it wasn't a direct response to what the IMF had said about the UK economy, I think that Rachel Reeves quote that you read to the Mirror is a great reflection of the frustration that is palpable whenever I speak to anyone in government, but certainly people in or close to the Treasury, about the economic situation facing the UK at the moment. Because it's worth remembering, if you think back to the start of 2026 and the kinds of things that Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves were saying, they hoped, I think actually stronger than that, believed that 2026 would be the year when the UK economy would start to turn a corner, that people's cost of living pressures would ease. And they blame the US, essentially, and its activities in the Middle East for that no longer being their assumption about what will happen in 2026. I mean, actually, remember that Rachel Reeves did one of her two annual big economic statements to Parliament, although this one was quite a low-key one, the spring statement, just a few days after the war in Iran began. And she talked about how in the middle of 2026, inflation would fall to the Bank of England's 2% target rate. Well, that is not the government's view now, and it means that a lot of hard decisions that the government was already facing have been made a lot harder.
Henry, how is the government then going to have to respond? Because clearly they're concerned about the impact it's going to have on people here, even though the elements of what's going on are well beyond our borders.
I mean, the government still, like all of us, doesn't really know what the economic impact on the UK is going to be. They know there will be an economic impact, perhaps already has been an economic impact, but it slightly depends how long the Strait of Hormuz remains constrained for, and depends what the progress of those talks that you were just hearing about is. So I think the government is slightly in a brace position here, but the government, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, have as good as confirmed that there will be a package of support for households with energy bills come the autumn. We're talking October. But that it will be targeted at the least well off rather than universal of the sort of the energy package that was introduced in 2022 when the war in Ukraine began. So that is an attempt to limit the amount of money the government spends here, because fundamentally the government is already, as we were talking about yesterday and is also today on defence, that is an illustration of the fact that the government is already struggling to meet the various spending commitments that it has said it has.
Henry Zeffman in Westminster.